This is In Focus, where tonight we're tackling the subject of domestic abuse and much more. I'm here at NIDAS, got a panel of people alongside me this evening as we tackle the difficult subject of domestic abuse and domestic arguments and all things like that. Let me introduce you first and foremost to the panel. Over on the very far side, we've got Mansfield 103.2's Police and Crime Correspondent, Mr. Peter Jones. Very good evening to you.
And good evening to you.
We've also got Becky Mathaias. Have I said that right?
You have, that's right. Well done.
It might not happen for the rest of the show.
Right.
And also Sue Reddy from NIDAS as well. And also to my left, I've got Rebecca Jackson from Hopkins Solicitors as well. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Obviously, Valentine's Day this week. It's a time of the year really where the word love is quite often in the headlines and things like that, and it's associated really with being a time of year which people enjoy and celebrate all the good things about relationships. But I think one clear message which we're probably looking to get out of this tonight, Sue, from NIDAS, is the fact that behind closed doors it can sometimes be a very different story indeed.
It absolutely can. What we know, what we want to do is we want to enjoy Valentine's Day. It is a time of year that we celebrate love, positive relationships, but it's obviously a time of year that, you know, we know that domestic abuse does happen. It happens all year round, and Valentine's Day goes without any exception.
In terms of what Hopkins do, Rebecca, obviously I know that you guys do work very hard and very closely with NIDAS. Give me a bit more of an insight into the working relationship which you guys have. How does it marry up between a solicitors and a charity who does support sort of domestic violence and abuse sufferers and victims?
Well, it can depend really, Craig, on the particular lady or man who's coming to see us. They may well already be linked up with NIDAS, or they may not have any support whatsoever. If they don't have support from NIDAS, they'll always be my first point of call in the area, because they can provide support on a low level if it hasn't reached court proceedings yet, and also at court to provide support when they're giving evidence and before attending meetings with the client. So it's a very important relationship, because although we deal with the legal aspect of it, it's important that they have someone there who understands the more emotional side to it, and have that constant support alongside the legal aspects.
I think it's something which the entire panel will agree on, that domestic abuse sufferers and domestic violence sufferers find it very difficult to come out and speak in the first instance. So do you perhaps find at Hopkins, when you're having a meeting about potential divorce and things like that, that people are actually talking about these things and these issues are actually becoming discovered for the first time?
Yes, sometimes actually. When you discuss with clients about what they've been through in their relationship and take them through the processes of how they've felt, whether that be financial issues that they've encountered with their partners, or emotional issues, or physical issues. Some things they wouldn't even think about as domestic abuse would classify as domestic abuse. So it is actually quite interesting when you have those discussions with them, when the light kind of switches on with them and they think, oh, actually, maybe I have been abused and I've not actually realised it through however many years. So it's important that they have people like NIDAS who give them a bit more information about what would classify as domestic abuse.
And I imagine at that point as well, that's where it can get a little bit more serious in terms of the police, which is an apt time to bring in our former DCI, Peter Jones.
Yes, it is a problem that the police have been dealing with. I mean, you've got to bear in mind that they estimate that there's well over 1 million cases each year in England and Wales. And of course, I think the problem now, Rebecca, is that the victims don't get legal aid, do they, if they're dealing with it through the civil courts?
Well, actually, I think the conception of that is quite misleading. Legal aid is available. legal help and legal aid are available for victims of domestic abuse. So quite often I will have ladies or gentlemen that come in to see me, and they talk about the harassment that they have experienced from their ex-partner, and quite often we can write a warning letter to that ex-partner to set out the harassment that the lady or gentleman is receiving, warn them not to do it, and if they continue that harassment, then we would take further steps in the form of a non-molestation order.
Now, we talk a lot about how we can be supported, but I think what a lot of people won't particularly know is how domestic abuse and how domestic violence breaks down into certain areas. You talk about domestic violence, you don't need to paint a picture for that because you know what that's going to be. But in terms of domestic abuse, there are so many ways, aren't there, Becky, which, you know, people perhaps don't realise is actually abuse in the first case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Rebecca touched on it earlier when she talked about people coming into the solicitors with an appointment, things around financial and challenging, maybe just giving them £10 to do the shopping when they've got to buy family food, nappies, milk, etc. People just see that as being managing and budgeting. Actually, there's much more to that. And going back to the Valentines, a lot of what we may see in an early relationship as happy Valentines may well be that early start for us, early warning signs that there may be some coercion and some control within that relationship.
How?
I would suggest one of the early warning signs we often talk about is obsessive behaviours. So maybe turning up where you've gone out for drinks with friends, or maybe gone to the cinema with friends and they turn up, offering you a lift. What we'd see as being potentially nice behaviour, particularly when you're a young person. I think in your teens particularly, you would look at that as they care about you, that they're interested in you. Actually, that becomes quite obsessive and also possessive and jealous.
We talk about having support on social media and things like that, but has social media also now contributed to a way in which domestic abuse can take place?
Absolutely. I think, you know, especially through we know through Facebook, through Instagram, Twitter, all these social media platforms, being able to make threats through, and I'm sure our colleague from the police will sort of back me up in this, being able to sort of, you know, threaten individuals, especially if you share images which are personal between each other, and then those images are then, if one person threatens the other person and says, you know what, I'm going to show this off if you don't do such and such, or if you go out with your friends, you know, this is what I will do. So the consequences to that, which, you know, which is forming an unhealthy relationship. And as Becky said, you know, that then escalates into much more intimated threats. And what we know is that young people between the ages of 16 and 25 are at the greatest risk because of these intense relationships. And again, you know, Valentine's Day is a time where we kind of consider that as, you know, as a time for love and sharing and things like that. But actually, you know, our young people, you know, they don't often understand that. They want to sort of
be popular and be liked and be in a relationship and like that. And I think the social media aspect is also around the absent father that has been the perpetrator may use that platform to contact children, to have contact that they shouldn't be having, that may has been insisted by court or maybe bail conditions through the police, and they'll be using that as a way to make contact with both the victim and the children.
Obviously, we're in a week where it's Valentine's week. It's all about celebrating the love in a relationship, but, you know, with love comes hate, with light comes dark. Is that something which people need to be more aware of? Do they need to be perhaps think, well, that's not my partner, so I'm not going to say gender specific because it's not the case. That's not what my partner's doing. That's just their mentality. Is that something that needs to be made more prominent in the mainstream media, do you think?
I'd absolutely agree with that, and I think also about excuses. We would never agree that anything that people had chosen to do this because of alcohol or substance misuse, or just because they're in a grumpy mood or because they were really stressed. Actually, they're all excuses for behaving in a violent and aggressive and coercive way with your partner, and it's just unacceptable. Love isn't about controlling someone. Social media is
probably playing a key part in this now. You can get apps for phones, GPS tracker apps. Is that something you've seen more of over the last 5-10 years or so, since smartphones have developed this new age technology?
Yeah, and you know what? I mean, my role before sort of managing the project that is NIDAS, who I work for now. I worked as a frontline practitioner, just the same as Becky. And one of the technologies that we really advocated needed to happen were apps and safe ways for individuals to be able to use their phones quickly to be able to contact the police in those situations, because actually, phones have developed massively, and having a good safety and support plan in place is absolutely crucial. And I think you'd agree with me with that,
definitely.
Becky. And we're not just talking about adults; we're talking about children particularly. But having not just social media. I mean, we know that children use social media quite a lot, and actually they're the most apt, I think, in terms of being able to pick it up quite quickly, aren't they, and being able to use it. So, but social media plays a massive part these days in being able to keep somebody safe.
You mentioned the word kids there and bringing the children into the equation. Rebecca, as a family law specialist at Hopkins, when people come to see you and are talking about issues relating to domestic abuse and domestic violence, do you often have to ask the question whether the kids are involved in that as well? Does it need to go further down the line and look at maybe getting preventative orders from stopping the abuser from seeing the kids?
Definitely, and sometimes it actually works the opposite way. So they will quite often come and see me in respect of children issues, whether that be private law matters which involve generally father and mother discussing custody over a child, where the child's going to live, who the child's going to spend time with. Often through those discussions you find out from talking to the mother or father that there has been some domestic abuse there, and quite often the children have witnessed it and experienced it themselves. That may lead to social care involvement with the children, and then they might take issue with that. So it's important that the parent that's experiencing the domestic abuse takes steps to protect that child or children, to prove that they are prioritising the child over the relationship.
Sue and Becky from NIDAS, obviously the kids thing is like a big issue, but what I want to do is I want to put a different spin on this now. I want to have it go down a different road with this. Children who see a parent being abused, violently or otherwise, is it something which they absorb and potentially could lead to them becoming an abuser in later life?
I'd argue about them becoming an abuser. I think they can learn behaviours, but again, like we spoke about earlier, it's about making choices. We all make choices about what we do with our lives and our personalities and whether we go down one road or another. I think they can and they do absolutely are impacted on by what's happening in that house. And I think what happens often is there is some demonstrative behaviour within school environments, so they may become aggressive, may become very passive, and agree with everything that everyone's doing and try and be very popular and want to fit in. The
law has changed in the last couple of years or so, because before 2014 there would be no way of knowing when you meet a new partner if they've got a history of domestic abuse or domestic violence, but that all changed in 2014 with Clare's Law. Tell us a bit more.
Yes, it did, and this is a result of a incident that resulted in a death, and now it is a right for a parent to actually ask the police to check to see if the new partner has got a history of violence, not just abuse, but any violence.
And that is something which has really perhaps changed the way in which people enter into relationships, because it's not just females that can use this, males can use it as well. Looking at a few statistics for who has used this over the last couple of years or so. In Derby in 2015, 187 people used the service. In Nottinghamshire, 177, and then in 2016, 136 in Derby and 145 in Nottinghamshire. So it does show that people are learning the lessons, is the wrong word to use, but have heard the story and have maybe had doubts themselves and are therefore using the new law and the new power which is available to them.
Yeah, and I would still say, you talk about Nottinghamshire, 145, was that in the last year?
2016.
Oh, right, 2016. And, when you talk about the 14,000 reports of domestic abuse and those unreported, that's still a relatively low number. And actually, it was 2017 that actually Mansfield District Council ran a campaign to reinvigorate and just to remind people that actually that's a service that is still available. And what I would say as a domestic abuse support agency, I still think there's a long way to go to actually advertise and let people know about that, because still people don't fully understand that they have a right to know and a right to ask for that information. If you've got a concern about a new partner, you've got a concern about a partner that you've been seeing for a long time, whether you're male or female, above the age of 16, you've got the right to know, right to ask about that person's criminal.
Let's create a bit of a role play situation here then. It's obviously Valentine's night, so I'm sure there'll be a few people that have been out there and enjoying it, but there are a few perhaps singletons as well. Maybe they've caught their eye across the bar, or they've used a really cheesy chat up line or something like that, and they've 3 or 4 weeks on and they're quite happy, but there's something niggling in the back of the mind. What sort of things, Becky, would set alarm bells ringing for you if you just met a new partner? It's going quite well so far, 3 or 4 weeks. What sort of things would make you want to potentially look at using that avenue of Clare's Law?
I think even very, very small things like constantly commenting on what you're wearing and telling you, yeah, it looks nice, but your knees don't look right in that dress, or oh yeah, I like that skirt, but those shoes aren't right. So although they're trying to compliment you, there's some criticism within that. Also things like maybe changing what music you listen to. So very, very subtle things, but things that would make me feel very uncomfortable. I would say to you, and I say this to most women that I deliver a group to, that you're probably not going to have physical violence on your first date. That very rarely happens. It does happen, but it very rarely happens, because chances are you probably aren't going to go again. So they are very subtle things that you need to be looking for.
I think I would absolutely agree with you there, Becky, but when you talk about Clare's Law and at that point where you get that worry where you kind of think, actually, I'm a bit, I kind of want to, just find out a bit more about this person. It would have to be something like, where that new partner is sort of suggesting that my former partner did this to me, or I went through court and there's a restraining order and this is because of such and that's their fault, or they're not seeing their children, and I guess, or they might have been in prison before. Some people actually put that, some perpetrators actually give that information as a way to sort of, enable that the new partner, the victim, if you like, to kind of, to empathise with their situation. And so that's kind of a bit of a coercive sort of manipulation, if you like. And so that's quite a bit of a clever one to get your head around. And I guess you've probably seen this, Pete, and heard this 1,000 times. At that point, you wouldn't necessarily in the first few weeks sort of, I guess, ask for a Clare's Law, but certainly where you are introducing, children to that new relationship, and that's where, if there's an alarm bell ringing, just nip to your local police station, 101, ask that question. It's a right to ask. If you've got services involved with you, if you've got a local school, anybody can ask that question. Social care, health, us at NIDAS, other domestic abuse agencies, we can ask that on your behalf.
Yes, you've got to remember that people who are entering new relationships perhaps haven't been in a relationship for quite some time, and so they're looking for anything that will allow them for it to continue. And to some extent, they'll ignore some of the stuff that would be a warning sign to most of us, but it's because they actually want the relationship to work, and that's a problem that has to be addressed. You've got to look and see what's happening and make sure that you are identifying those problems and seeking advice.
People always think about the woman being the victim of the abuse and the violence, but also it does happen to men as well, and that's one key thing which I'm sure, especially at this time of year, we really need to highlight.
Yeah, and definitely we do get less referrals from males, but I would probably say to you that it's exactly the same as the women. The lack of confidence, not knowing where to access services, not wanting to look like they've done something wrong, and maybe they're coming to us to say they're the victim, but they're not. That can happen, and people will sometimes make a mistake in how they assess that situation. But I think also just being very macho and very gender-based, that men don't access. We know access services in any kind, whether that be health, education or support services, in the same way that women do. And I think the emphasis is not on them to access in the same way either, because for a lot of our women in particular, they're family based, so it might be that they've accessed support for the children, they've never accessed it for themselves, and then they get it for themselves on the back of having support for the children.
So you're here at NIDAS, I know that you guys do support men as well who have been victims of abuse. Are there many that come forward, or do you find it is a really large difference between males and females coming forward?
I think what I want to remind you of is that, we know that women are still, it's a gendered issue, women are still primarily the victims of domestic abuse, and 1 in 4 women compared to what we think is about 1 in 6 men, and that's a bit of a figure that I'm not too confident about. But certainly, what we do know, and also that the violence that women experience usually carries greater harm and greater risks. So that's something just to highlight as well. And the abuse that men experience is less physical, so you are more highly likely to experience death as a result of domestic abuse as a woman than you are as a man. However, it's still a form of domestic abuse. It's still not acceptable, whatever form of abuse, and we do support males at NIDAS.
Just looking at some figures provided by the charity Menkind, the national charity who support male victims of domestic and partner abuse. For every 3 victims of domestic abuse, 2 will be female and 1 will be male. Peter Jones.
Yes, I mean, let's just remember that we're talking about any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members regardless of gender or sexuality. So you're talking male on female, female on male, male on male, female on female. It's that whole range. Let's not just assume that it's one particular type of offence. If you're in a relationship and it's an intimate relationship, whatever your gender, then you can be a victim of domestic abuse, and you need to consider getting the right and appropriate advice.
Now, obviously, I'm going to bring Rebecca in here on this. Obviously, the laws have changed in terms of openly gay marriages and things like that as well now. So in years to come, there will be, if there hasn't been already, couples of the same sex who come to file for a divorce or separation or whatever. Would it be the same standard of practice for you identifying somebody who has been a victim of abuse?
Definitely, and I would say I've already experienced that coming through with same-sex relationships, victims of domestic abuse, both male and female. So the criteria is obviously the same. But I did actually want to just pick up on a point that Becky did say with regards to men and accessing it from a legal perspective. I do think that they are under the assumption that the law's favoured to women rather than male, and there has been a number of developments over the years which mean that isn't correct. Whilst that may have been a situation in the past where the law tended to weigh a lot on the mother, now the presumption is equal rights. It is. So I think males should be aware of that and not choose not to seek legal advice just because they assume that the mother will get more rights than them. That's not the case.
The biggest thing always is speaking out. What's your message, your brief message to those to try and get help?
Things have moved on. People are there to help and support you, and there are lots of people who are willing and able to do it, as you've just been told. So make use of it, seek some advice and see what help can be offered.
Rebecca, same to you, your message.
I would mirror that of Peter, just that try to come out of your shell, try and see who you can contact, seek the appropriate advice, and hopefully the right person will be able to help you.
And from 2 people who work in an area, at a charity specialising in this area, what's your message? We'll start with you, Becky.
I think it's exactly the same, but I think also just to say, go to the person you feel most comfortable with. If that doesn't have to be a professional, it may be a friend, and we will accept a phone call from other people as well as the actual victim of the domestic abuse, so that we can start that process of supporting.
And finally, Sue, yourself.
What I would also say is that agencies working with staff members, particularly businesses, just remember, health can be incapacitated, mental health can be incapacitated. Listen, look for the signs and symptoms, make sure that you are there and you ask those questions, but always point them in the right direction of support. And remember that, it's not related to age as well. One of the points I wanted to say is that, anybody of any age can experience domestic abuse. It's really important to sort of know that service and support is available for anybody.
Fantastic. Well, it has been a really insightful conversation and discussion tonight. I hope you at home have picked up anything that you need to from this. There are places out there which can help you Domestic abuse and violence is not okay. If you are somebody who you think that you're suffering at the hands of this and you might identify with something which you've heard this evening, do be brave and make that step to go and get your voice heard. There are plenty of ways you can do so. All the details are on our website. And what about if the shoe is on the other foot for a moment? What about if you're in a relationship and you've started to notice some of your own behaviours which you might be questioning in your own head and thinking, could that be looked at as abuse? Could something I'm doing be looked at as a form of abuse? You can change and you can get help and advice for that as well. So please do so, because on Valentine's week, whilst we don't know what goes on behind closed doors, and whilst we're not always happy to talk about it and to be open with what's happening, there is help out there. Domestic abuse and domestic violence is never okay. This is Mansfield 103.2's In Focus. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.